Hello and welcome to the AutoTalk Weekly Wrap. And I'm going to add my traditional co-host in straight away for this one. Graham McDonald, it's episode 80. How on earth did we get this far?
Because we talked enough shit over 80 episodes that amazingly people still want to listen to our automotive dribble. I think that's worthwhile in it.
And amusingly, it's only about 5% of the shit we talk.
What? So the rest is factual? What?
No, as in the rest of the time, you and I are still walking around talking junk anyway. It just happens we just record about 5% of it.
Yeah, we do that for a living. And 95% of what we talk about can't go on the show. So I think 5% is a pretty good sort of a number.
I didn't say that. I did not say that. Yes.
Welcome into episode 80, everyone. Thanks a lot for sticking along with us.
Yes. Graham and I are just back this week from another one of our 1,000-kilometre challenges in an EV. How did you find that one, Graham? This one was a little more successful than our last one.
Are we allowed to say what it is? Are we allowed to mention the model?
Yeah, you can say it.
Yeah. So it was the new Toyota BZ4X, and I was mightily impressed because I'm a Toyota fanboy, as you probably know if you watch the show often enough. And this just felt like hopping into a really nice, comfy RAV4 Prime, but without.
It's like an old friend.
Yeah, it is, and that's what Toyota do so well. They do vehicles that just fit like gloves. Everything worked. All the buttons were in the right place. The seats felt gorgeous. Really enjoyable. Apart from the fact that I've still got that little sticking point in my mind, we had to take extra time to go through the charging ritual and regime and planning and that sort of stuff. And for an old petrol fanboy like me, it takes some getting used to. But it's a successful 1,000 Ks.
And you got to see slightly behind the skirt at Toyota New Zealand as well. Was there anything you spotted there that you liked?
I did. That new Crown, that certainly floated my boat. That is a good-looking car. I'm sorry if we're not supposed to talk about these things, but there was a new Crown sitting in the car park. Yeah, good-looking machine. And obviously, we've seen the new Prius before. There's been a couple of those floating around. I think for a Toyota, that's going to be a very successful car indeed overseas. Not sure if it's going to come to New Zealand or not, but in my opinion, it probably should. It'd sell pretty well. And I do like the halo look on those new Land Cruisers too, just quietly. The new Land Cruiser. Yeah, that's right. The halo lights and stuff. They've got
now, we'll bring in now our other two panels. We have a full panel this week. It's been a while, the full panel. So wearing a Scott Dixon cap is David Crawford, and sitting in front of that bright red Better surfboard down in Christchurch is Amos Banbury. I never thought there was that much surf down in Christchurch, or am I totally wrong? I feel like go there and you just never see the beach.
There's a couple of staff members that gas out the back door sometimes when it's all running right. Yeah.
Yeah. And David, how are things down in the side of Wellington Harbour?
The sleep out is progressing, so we've got the internal installation, so they'll be jibbing next week, and they're doing the weatherboarding today, so it's all good. And one of the builders jumped over the back fence out to the harbour and threw out his rod and caught a nice pan-sized snapper within about 10 minutes. So
not bad.
That's good.
On a rising tide, that they're feeding on crabs at the moment. So he had a little trick as to what bait he was using, which, of course, like a typical fisherman, I'm not going to share because I'm going to try it myself.
So you'll share before we get to the show then. You can tell us quietly, David. No one's listening.
Well, bait that's a bit crab-like. Let's put it that way.
Cannibalism.
No one ever guessed that one coming.
Yes. Well, now, it may still be somewhat of the holiday silly season where normally not a lot happens, but the motoring industry seem to not get the message, and it has been a very, very busy week for automotive news. I guess it's not so much the industry that's done it. It's certain Mr. Simeon Brown, who, National put out some fairly tough targets for their first 90 days. It would appear that he's decided to take those 90 days, smash the crap out of them, do everything they've said, and then he's going beyond into stuff that wasn't in their 90 days. And he's making some friends and causing some concern at the same time, depending on who you talk to. But we'll jump right into that now, because the first story, and this was an exclusive to AutoTalk. No one else has this, though I'm sure everyone else will have gone and copy and pasted our stuff today. And that is that Simeon has ordered officials to start work on the CCS review. And it's interesting on this. It's an interesting week for what came out from Simeon. I sent a whole pile of questions through to Simeon earlier on in the week. I wanted to know about RUC. I wanted to know about the clean car standard. I wanted to know about some other things. And the next day, the RUC announcement comes, which we'll talk about soon. And then they delayed a little and decided to give me this. So Transport Minister Simeon Brown appears to be moving faster than expected on multiple changes to schemes aimed at reducing the average CO2 emissions of vehicles entering the fleet, with the Clean Car Standard the next issue for attention. Still within the National Act, NZ First Government's initial 90-day plan period. Do we have a combo name for that yet? Is it the NACTIF or something that we're calling them? The NACTIF government?
We should work on that for the next show. Some little catchy acronym.
Well, look, you've got blue, you've got pink, you've got yellow, you've got black and grey. We call it like the Rainbow Coalition. No,
there's a thought.
Still within their 90-day plan period, Brown had overseen the end of the clean car discount and then confirmed electric vehicles will pay road user charges at the same rate as a diesel vehicle. Now he has confirmed, first to AutoTalk, that he's requested officials to start work on reviewing the CCD's sister, the Clean Car Standard. This is faster than expected, with some operators not expecting it to happen, despite Brown declaring his intention to review the scheme until mid-year or beyond. Interestingly, I had answers from the same questions to Simeon from the MIA this week, and they'd had in their planning that they weren't going to see a review on this until mid-year. So interesting to see that's coming through so quickly. It's underway so quickly. David Crawford is nodding his head there. David, you've got a different take?
Well, considering that the CCS has to be reviewed by no later than 30 June 2024, Simeon Brown is just reminding officials you don't start the review mid-year, you complete it by mid-year. So, he's just doing what is legislatively required. And it's interesting. I emailed Simeon congratulating him on removing the clean car discount and reminded him that the CCS was next in line and that the review statutorily had to be done by the middle of the year. So, it was timely to get on with it. I didn't get a reply, but I'm not surprised that Simeon has moved, because all of the discussions that I've had with him before I retired indicated he was really keen to see this revised and reviewed. And he's done the discount, so it's the standard that's logically next on. Keep the pressure on, keep the momentum going.
We'll cut through to what he's actually said. He's directed them to do it, a comprehensive review of the Clean Car Importer Standard. Now, he is now calling it the Clean Car Importer Standard, and I asked specifically through his comms people, have they made an error there? And he said, no, that is what we're choosing to call it now, which is an interesting difference. The government is supportive of the Clean Car Importer Standard to ensure that New Zealand continues to receive the supply of low and zero emission vehicles being manufactured globally, Brown says. However, it's important that the Clean Car Importer Standard strikes the balance between reducing transport emissions and ensuring that New Zealand policy settings continue to allow the automotive sector and the wider economy to grow. The review will be aimed at ensuring that the Clean Car Importer Standard reflects international market standards and ensures the availability, affordability, and mix of vehicles needed in the New Zealand market, while also achieving our goals of reducing emissions in the light vehicle fleet. And he's also confirmed that under the review, disability vehicles will be exempted from the standard. And I've spoken to some friends within the disability vehicle sector, and I can tell you all that Rod Miller is very, very happy with that news. So yeah, we've had some comment from the trade on this. Amy Wiley from the MIA, they welcome the review and they look forward to collaborating on it. They're looking for pragmatic, sensible, and reasonable outcomes. They are keen to see it kick off as soon as possible, and basically saying that 26, 27, 28 were pretty much unachievable for many, and so we really need to do this. VIA, they're also pleased to see it happening, and they would actually like to see it discontinued and replaced with a system where users are charged for their carbon either at the point of sale or when brought to market and passed on to the consumer. This could be through the ETS or through its own dedicated system, but this requires carbon to be meaningfully priced, which is currently not the case. I can't see them throwing out the system itself, but interesting take on that. To New Zealand, Neeraj Lala, he says they've been doing pretty well under the CCS. They've got a solid balance sheet for both their new and used operations when it comes to the system. But he says that it's definitely time for the review, and it gets too tough. Ultimately, he very clearly said that he has far more trust in Brown to do this review or to oversee this review than he did in previous Minister Michael Wood. It's a bit of a dig there back at Wood. And Simon Rutherford from Ford is looking for fair and reasonable targets from the review, as you would expect. So I think what we're talking about here is I think they're going a little bit beyond what the scheduled check the figures, make sure they still work kind of review is. This is sounds to me like we're going to see quite a step back from the adventurous targets they kind of had in place.
Yes, they will.
Structural change.
Well, by the way, I'm not surprised by Greg Epps' comments on wanting the standard to go. That's been pretty much that what he's proposed has been pretty much Fair's position all the way along. They wanted meaningful carbon pricing, which is politically unacceptable to governments, it seems, because that means really high carbon pricing. But in terms of what Simeon Brown's doing here, I'm not surprised at all. But I'd just like to touch on Neeraj's comments about Simeon versus Michael Wood. In the lead up to when the standard and the discount came into effect, both Fair and MIA lobbied really hard. And for the Motor Industry Association, we had Michael Wood zoom into our meeting at least 2 times. It might have been 3 times. And the overwhelming impression from members sitting around the table at the end of those sessions was that he listened, but we didn't have at the time much hope that he would take on board what was said. So it left the industry with a distinct feeling that it wasn't trusted, that the importers, both of used and new vehicles, were to be dealt to rather than managed, and that he was taking his advice from other quarters. Roll in, the election comes, Simeon's now the man in the hot seat. So far, Simeon has demonstrated, in my view, the traits of what industry, in my experience, expects from a minister. It sits down and he sits down and he talks, he listens, he makes up his mind, but he doesn't make up his mind until he's consulted and chewed the fat with those that are directly affected. And unlike the discount, which was affecting their members and MIA members, also affected the trade, MTA, because of the everything that had to be done at the dealership. In terms of the standard, this is something that affects almost singularly importers of used cars and importers of new vehicles. So dealing with that and saying this is what we're going to do, and we're going to make the targets a marathon rather than a sprint. So we've got a timely transition that allows importers to choose more carefully the stock that they want to bring in, and particularly for new vehicles, which have got a much longer planning horizon, 3 to 5 years through their model mix and pre-planning and everything like that. Having targets set out over a longer period that are achievable but still a stretch is much more important and much more achievable in reducing emissions in the long run than going hard and fast, which is what the Greens and Labour wanted to do. So I'm really hopeful that there's going to be some meaningful change here that makes it easier for the new and used sectors to choose their stock, manage their stock, and choose low emission vehicles that are going to fit the measure and be useful for New Zealanders.
Graham, from the used side, what do you guys want to see from all this? it gone?
Well, obviously, I'm not as plugged in as I used to be towards the way that VIA policy works. But I was just thinking, it's effectively all the points that were raised in the consultation and discussion with industry prior to the election around CCS. But rather than not being listened to, and I think David's spot on, it appeared all the way through that the previous minister was not necessarily interested in engaging with industry. It was, he needed to, as part of his role, he needed to be seen to, but decisions were being taken really either had already been made or would be taken without any particular input from the industry. So we weren't necessarily a sounding board rather than just a necessary function of being the minister that you had to at least be seen to be engaging. So it appears to me as if the industry is in at least part going to get what industry had wanted, not because industry is greedy, but because industry often are the best people to at least advise on the likelihood of being able to achieve a particular goal and how it can collaboratively achieve that across government policy and industry's ability to meet that. And if you look at it from the use side, and look, Kit from VIA, I think did a really stellar job in the way that he worked through a proposal to the minister at the time, and that proposal obviously has been dusted off back to Simeon around how CCS could be better managed. And it's really gratifying to see that advice being at least listened to. Taken on board, I don't know. Don't forget, this is an announcement of the review process. This is not the decision on what it will look like. But it's pretty clear from the outset, from the wording used, that there is going to be meaningful change. And if you look at the language around making it affordable and making it pragmatic, those are the very two key points that were raised across both MIA and VIA submissions, was that any legislation change has to be affordable, and that means affordable to the consumer, but also has to be pragmatic for the distributors or the importers to meet. And so here we are. And just before I hand over on that point, the name, it's a really good point around that, because it is just an imported standard. There's been no work done, and it appears to be no work done on in-service vehicles when it comes to testing or length of service or things like that. So it is, I think, a better reflection by name about what this legislation actually affects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's going to be an interesting review. I feel it's going to be, they'll move relatively quickly on it. Simeon doesn't seem to hang around on stuff. So I suspect we'll know fairly quickly this year what the outcome of this is going to be. I don't think it'll mess with the system that much, but I do think we're just going to see those rates tumble. I mean, David, you may have correct me on this, but my understanding is we overtake the European standard on passenger cars next year or the year after, and commercials the year after that, or is it the other way around?
Excuse me. Yes, certainly by 27, we get ahead of the current EU standard. Now, the EU standard, though, is in the process of being updated. But the thing about the way the standard works for the EU is it's not progressive year by year by year. They've got a target that they've got to reach by a certain date. And so they could keep going at their rate and then suddenly have a massive drop. But of course, what that does by setting a target, say 5 years out, that gives the manufacturers time to re-engineer and remix and do all of those things that they have to do from a manufacturing perspective. Because, it's things like, dies having to be set, all of the design work and procurement, the ordering, the parts supply. It is a massive operation to make vehicles these days. So that's how the EU works, but we were getting ahead of it. And so the steepness of our rate of achievability, from not having a standard to having that the previous government brought in, was so steep. It didn't recognise or take into account that these other countries, the EU, have been working on this for 15 years. The US have had their standard in place for about 12, 13 years. So they've had time to start achieving it. And this government said, we're so far behind, we've got to catch up. And we said, yeah, let's catch up by the early 2030s. But no, they wanted to catch up and get ahead and be a leader, because that was the language that they were using. And they had other factors, other people chirping away in the air saying, of course we can do it. Those importers, they're they're just bluffing you. Of course they can do it. But our market is so small.
The only places we should be leading is dairy production and rugby stats.
It's a really good point, David. That I think the industry as a whole, particularly towards the end of the last term of government, we just felt like we were a little bit dirty. We felt like we were just somehow seen as this little bit of a, the dirty uncle in the cupboard that we didn't really want to see anymore. And I think, I know that's gussing at the language a wee bit, but I just feel the industry was neither valued nor seen as adding any particular value. In fact, what we were actually doing was we were like being, I know this is a bad analogy, Richard, but we were like being seen as cigarette salespeople. And we were tolerated because people still wanted cigarettes, but we weren't really wanted at the end of the day because we're selling a thing that intrinsically, for some people anyway, appeared to go against or counterintuitive to the ideal they had about how people should be mobile. And personal transport just wasn't part of that mix. That's the impression I feel in certain circles was coming on through.
Yeah, and look, we're a technology taker for both new and used. And for you guys in the used sector, you've just got a shorter time frame, but you still rely on other people producing the vehicles in the first place and then becoming available through the used market supply channels. But for the new vehicles, because the New Zealand market's so small, we have to be able to leverage that technology that's been developed overseas. And so not having a standard for the new sector was, in the long run, not really in our best interest. I mean, I think the new vehicle sector accepted a standard was required to help us get the allocation. The trick is, how do we set the target so that some, a very small minority pay penalties, but most don't and will have credits, because you still have the targets at a rate that says to the parent manufacturers, we need these vehicles. But we're going that way. It's getting harder and harder for the manufacturers not to have vehicles with some form of electrification because all the major markets are going that way. So we're going to get it. We just need to keep up and be a really fast follower as opposed to being a leader. And that's the trick. For us to have been a leader, that would have killed us. To be a fast follower, no, that is achievable.
Amos, I can see you in the, just to say for Amos for a second, Richard, sitting quietly in the corner there. There's a lot to unpack for you as well in the finance sector, because I think there was a real risk that, particularly when it comes to finance, we haven't seen huge penetration at the top end of the market in EVs, because the buyers of those, my impression, tend to be a little bit more cashed up perhaps than the mind of town that I play in, for example. But there was a real risk that the market was going to move away from, I suppose, finance affordability. The further, the harder up the chain it got. And the very people that require transport in New Zealand, I'll use it really carefully, require personal transport, we're literally in danger of being priced out of that marketplace. And you're the person, if you want it, is providing those particular services. So there's a huge effect on the business that you conduct.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, shifting the penetration rates of new, like finance. You see it talking to business managers at new dealerships, like they're looking for jobs. Just like, because if they've got a commission base, it's really interesting. Yeah.
It's hard to compete with 1% from the bank, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'd just like to note before we move on, Graham, that interesting term used there, dirty uncles. As we all know, there are still a few dirty uncles in the trade.
Well, I haven't got any uncles.
Figuratively, literally, all that kind of stuff.
But the main dirt's not CO2, even though everybody will tell you it is. The main dirt are the particulate and noxious compounds that come out the exhaust. And the way to deal with those is through a vehicle exhaust emissions rule, which has also been done in a timely manner as well. So, and I think Simeon Brown has a better understanding of the component parts of what makes up the transport sector and vehicles and standards, and is prepared to call the interventions by the correct name for the correct purpose. He's not muddying the waters.
Well, you'll understand what I mean by this, David. Not sure whether many people outside of the circle will. No, we'll not explain it further. I think Brown is less likely to listen closely to a former Green Party crony that found himself in a lucky position.
We don't know what you're saying there, Richard. We don't hear a thing.
although he's still there and is still in the team, but yes, Simeon will ask him some really hard questions.
Yes.
And I think the point is, when we're talking about officials, the role of officials is to serve the minister of the day. And that's the primary role. And they do that by giving free and frank advice, so there will be contestability. And secondly, the right approach that officials need to take, and I was always very strong on this, is the ministers need to understand, the first thing ministers need to hear when they say, we want to do this, is, yes, let's do it unless there's a good idea, good reasons not to. But all too often when ministers say we want to do this or that, officials' responses tend to be, oh, we don't think it should happen unless you can do that. So straight away the minister hears no, no, no. And I'm hoping that the transport officials under this government adopt it. So yes, let's do it unless there's good reasons not to. So therefore you have the genuine reasons why you might not want to do it, or you might need to tweak it. But I think some officials are going to be in for a firmer ride, because I know Simeon is quite sharp on some of this stuff.
Right, let's move on to the second story of the week. And I promise you, Amos, there's some lovely finance stories coming up later on.
I'm happy as. I'm all right.
He's just sitting back.
And that is road user charges. That's right. RUC is coming to electric vehicles soon. Now, I'm not going to read off that story. We do it over the website. I have a story that's coming in our magazine that's out today that I'm going to read a bit from that. If I just have... where are we? Here we go. So government's confirmed the details of how and what electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids will pay for road user charges. From April, owners of light EVs will pay $76 per 1,000 kilometres, in line with the equivalent diesel-powered vehicle. Heavy electric vehicles are set to keep their exemption for another 2 years. Owners of plug-in hybrid vehicles will pay a reduced rate of $53 per 1,000 kilometres. The partial rate of $53 per 1,000 kilometres assumes that on average a plug-in vehicle will consume petrol at a rate of just just under 3 litres per 100 kilometres. Legislation will be passed before April 1 to enable the reduced RUC rate for plug-in hybrid vehicles. The rest of this is actually, I believe, already in place, just from it was an exemption, so it just kind of drops. Officials have estimated that at the end of the RUC exemption on EVs and PHEVs will generate 80 to 100 million in 2024-2025. This is presented as a range. There are several variables in forecast in the figure, including the number of kilometres travelled by EV owners. To give people some context, I think it's between about 3.5 and 4 billion collected between the fuel excise and RUC systems. Currently, the biggest slant on that being towards the RUC side of the metric. I think it's only about 1.2 billion collected in fuel excise, and the rest is in RUC. Petrol tax and distance-based RUC are paid by road users to contribute to the cost of maintaining our roads, but EVs and plug-in hybrids have been exempted from RUC. Brown says transitioning EVs and plug-in hybrids to RUC is the first step in delivering on and this is the important bit here, on the National Act Coalition commitment to bring all vehicles into the RUC system. This transition to RUC is about fairness and equity. It will ensure that all road users are contributing to the upkeep and maintenance of our roads, irrespective of the type of vehicle they choose to drive. Points out it was National that previously created the exemption. Generally, I think the industry's been expecting this. There is some discussion about the whole PHEV aspect to it. And we've got BYD's Warren Wilmot, who they've got a pile of big PHEVs coming this year, including a Ute. But says that needs to be some more thought around RUC on PHEVs, while there is still no RUC on fuel. Well, petrol cars aren't paying RUC. Well, there's RUC on there's fuel excise duty on petrol. They need to be more creative. Christchurch's EV City owner Dave Boot, he thinks that some dealers that are shifting EVs at the moment will probably just focus back onto hybrids, just by the temporary cost advantage they have. So yes, it's an interesting move, this. It is not necessarily ideal, and I feel that, and look, cards on the table, I am an EV owner. I own 2 EVs and a petrol car, a small, very fuel-efficient petrol car, thankfully. I think really we're going to have to, if we take Simeon's comment that this is about equity and fairness, a little bit of a hit on what is equitable and fair, as we have been for a while, until the whole ruck system comes into place. Because I'm going to run some numbers for you here, and bearing in mind that this comes from a scheme that has been quoted as being about equity and fairness, and that's for 1,000 kilometres when you're talking about ruck, or sorry, whatever tax towards running the car is, whether it be excise or ruck. If you take the Toyota RAV4, Toyota BZ4X, basically same size car, same purpose, not drastically dissimilar in road impact, I would suggest. For every 1,000 kilometres, the petrol car will pay $60 in tax. The hybrid car will pay $40.81 in tax. The PHEV $60.70 in tax, and the EV version, the BZ4X, $76 in tax. So there's a massive, massive advantage there for hybrids, and EVs certainly are at the far end of the scale when it comes to that. So, interesting to see this come along. I think the key point there, I think you got to get not too far into the weeds on who's paying what, is that ruck for everything is coming.
Yeah, and it's something. This story takes me back, Richard. Firstly, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the exemption for electric vehicles was first put in place under the last term of the previous Labor, or the previous before last Labor, 2005 to 2008. And it was my team at the time that did the legwork on behalf of ministers for that. So the original exemption went in almost 20 years ago, and it had been rolled over several times. And when it was last rolled over, about 3 years ago, I think, I was incredibly surprised that they decided to roll it over again. So I'm not surprised that the exemption has come off. The numbers that you cited, there are any number of ways to cut the numbers, Richard, and I've done this, but the important point is that setting the ruck rate and having it equitable between fuel excise duty and road user charges is done on a basis of an average of 14,000 kilometres a year. So it's done at a macro level rather than, when you get into individual models, there's a lot of give and take. So when you do it at a macro level at 14,000 kilometres a year, then it is equitable. But my view was back in that 2005 and 8.
How is it equitable at 14,000 kilometres versus... You're still going to have a 30% difference between an EV and a hybrid vehicle.
No, but remember, it's just done at a macro level, the average efficiency for petrol vehicles versus diesel vehicles, blah, blah, blah. When you get into individual models, it varies quite a bit. But the point that I was about to make is that the advice that I provided back in 2006, when this was first being promoted, was that there should be differential ruck for light vehicles. So it is, I think the lack of fairness is that you can't say that a small, these EVs that are equivalent of, a passenger car is the same as a ute in terms of weight, size and efficiency. So there should be a two-step, but the problem is that officials view road user charges as an impact charge rather than as an excise. Whereas fuel excise is very much an excise in terms of the more you use, the more you pay. And so to make ruck more like an excise and to be taxed on an equivalent basis rather than treating it just as an impact charge, the impact being the damage made to the road, you should have a split road user charge below 3.5 tonnes. So for a vehicle up to 2 tonnes, you'd have it at a lower rate, and a vehicle that's between 2 and 3.5, you'd have it at the rate that it currently is. There you would get more of an equitable outcome. Pricing for the plug-in hybrid, they've always used that as an excuse not to remove the exemption. But, the trick on the plug-in hybrid is, what is the average efficiency? And if you set it, say, at 3 litres per 100k, it's sort of getting there. But if you set it at 2, it would have encouraged people to not charge it on electricity. So, I mean, it's getting this, the plug-in hybrid is the one that muddies the water. So the only way to make it clean is to take fuel excise duty away altogether. And there are some challenges around that because there's leakage in the ruck system and there's very little leakage in the fuel excise because it's hard to defeat the fuel excise. It's at the pump. But it's much easier to defeat road user charges. So until they can overcome some of those practicalities. And then when you get into ruck, my view is it should become electronic. And that's then got overtones of Big Brother. So some people really strongly would object to that. But if you do go electronic, then you've got all of these abilities to be able to segment the roads, and you've got your pricing, you've got congestion, you've got technology, you've got all these sorts of things that you can either incentivize or de-incentivize. And so your equitability becomes easier because you do it over a wider range of considerations. At the moment, ruck is very, very blunt. I could go on because I've done the analysis many times over many years, and I had to when I was an official. And there's no easy answer to this one.
Yeah. I don't think you're going to feasibly get electronic GPS tracked ruck until New Zealand First are out of there, because unfortunately there might be a few too many. It's certainly the tinfoil hat wearing my rights party at the moment. And sorry, New Zealand First voters, but there's some truth to that.
It would be hard to get it through a cost benefit because of the cost of retrofitting that information. But you can certainly make it easier for brand new vehicles coming in to do it. Arguably, you could also ask the used to do it, although the used would object because it's just another cost that then is on the supply of that vehicle. But for new vehicles, yes, you could make that and transition it in over time.
Interestingly, New Zealand is a leader in that tech space, and I've already had a chat to E-Road, and there's E-Roads going into my 2 electric vehicles because I don't trust my wife to go and not drive around without another car.
I think that's one of the big issues facing the system. And first of all, I'll take up a point with you there, Richard, I'm not a New Zealand First voter. God, no, I'm not a New Zealand First voter. But I think the whole idea around this, you did talk about the tinfoil hat regard. I think there are a lot of people out there genuinely concerned about the idea of their driving being identified at that micro level, about where they go, what they do. And I'm sure there are plenty across on the shoplifting side of the spectrum, can I say that? And there are plenty across it's not party specific. People are, I think, genuinely concerned about the Big Brother attitude towards the government reaching into their garage. Right or wrong, you can say the same point, we all carry cell phones, right? So it's not a political point that's being made. And I think then, just in terms of compliance, and David touched upon it, the level or the lack of compliance in the current ruck system is astonishing once you dig a bit deeper. And I think officials probably suspect it when they talk about leakage, but as somebody, so for example, one of my previous roles, we used to do pricing of repossessions for one of the finance companies. And so we were looking at vehicles, particularly commercial vehicles, that were not necessarily handed over willingly by their owners. In other words, you got them job fresh. The number of defeat devices I have found in courier vans, commercial vans, trades vehicle vans, utes and bits and pieces, it would make an official blush. So we know what's going on. And I worry a little bit that if you then don't accept the argument about going towards an e-ruck system for the entire fleet, and I think that's a political bridge to cross, and you go towards a label-based system, just the level of lack of compliance out there from people is going to be very difficult to both manage and then police, because who's going to police it? You and I spent a half an hour or so in Taupo this week while we waited for the vehicle to charge, and I went for a bit of a wander up the road to the warehouse. As I do, I wander along the line of parked cars, look at registration labels. The lack of compliance to something as simple as registration, let alone a fee-based system like ruck, is astonishing. And no one's policing it. No one's going to police it. Good luck.
Yeah. Whenever you do e-ruck without necessarily the digital connect as such, does the unit necessarily have to talk to the system on a regular basis? I mean,
Well, if it doesn't, then it comes down to being able to turn it on and off, doesn't it? So if it's not connected to the system, then the system can be turned off, right? And as they say, what goes on tour stays on tour when it comes to your car's history, behaviour, and mileage.
I think if people think they can drive through Auckland without someone working out where that their cars pass through Auckland is a little bit of a stretch, I suspect.
Well, that's true, Richard. But I think what worries people, and this goes across all sectors of society, is if the ERAC was only used for the purposes of ERAC, they probably wouldn't worry. But then it goes across to insurance companies who want to say, well, were they speeding at the time? Because that would be determinable. Then the police would want to have access to it for other sorts of reasons. And so and even if they didn't, it's just the thought, and that's where people's minds go to. So Big Brother has been a real issue, and I think that's something that society just struggles with. And I think society is going to struggle with it more and more. I see the advantages.
What's the answer?
I see the advantages of ERAC. Well, I think if they're going to bring in ERAC, then they need to do things like we originally did with the driver's license, was that you couldn't use driver's license as an official form of ID for things like lotto and other bits and pieces. But we lost that argument over years because it sort of became a recognizable form of ID. But it just needs to be locked down so tight that the information is collected and used only for the purposes of which the information is generated. And that needs to be locked in legislation, and then people told that that is the case, i.e. no transferal to police, no transferal to IRD, no transferal to insurance companies, etc.
Oh boy, the checks in the post.
I think that's going to be quite hard.
Would you be happy with the government tracking your car?
Me personally, I couldn't even really care, but I can understand how some people could have an issue. But I'm not getting up to too much mischief, so
yeah,
goes
back to funny old arguments about the more how to put this interesting ends of the finance spectrum, where we've had cell phone connected interlock devices fitted to cars for a while,
Yeah.
And the hue and cry that created.
Sorry?
Let's say, Amos, the hue and cry that created in the sector when I think the media, certain shouty aspects of the media, suddenly worked out that, yes, there were interlock finance devices available that were monitoring people's cars. It's like, well, that's news to us. Let's make a story about it. And there was a huge dust-up about it.
The stories generally came when the cars were turned off. Not because they were being tracked. The stories turned up when people miraculously didn't pay their payments and ended up having their cars turned off.
Yeah.
Well, so here I am, XYZ journalist reporting on behalf of some trash news organisation. I just hear that you have, there's a possibility that your road user charge has expired, your vehicle's odometer reading and the road users are now out of sync. Guess what? Bad news, Brown, car turned off.
Yeah.
Well, that's what, as David says, the government needs to kind of like enshrine into law as such. So yeah,
the checks in the post, boys. The checks in the post.
It's going to be an interesting period. I think we've got to take it as a temporary period. So look, I was always I'm an EV owner. As before, I was always pro the fact that we should pay RUC. I do believe everyone can contribute. I did not expect them to launch at the full rate of a 3.5 ton ute. I thought there would be some form of differential, which there isn't. But the way I've kind of consoled myself to it is the fact that this is a temporary situation. It has to be seen as a temporary situation. And I've got to go speak at a fleet conference down in Christchurch at the end of February. Amos will hopefully go for a beer when I'm down there for that one. You should come out. It's actually a really good conference. My position to the fleets there that I'm going to be speaking to, I'm speaking on electric vehicles, is that, look, electric vehicles by and large are still going to be the cheaper vehicle to operate. But the other aspect to keep in mind is that this is temporary. And what if you go and take on a fleet of, you go and say, well, no, I'm not going to buy EVs now, but because there's RUC on them, it makes this fleet of petrol cars actually not as bad, still worse, but not as bad as it did before. So what if you go and do that? You go and buy yourself 500 petrol cars or 500 hybrids, and then a year down the track, Simeon says, right, ruck on everything. Excise gone, ruck on everything. Well, you're stuck there for two or three more years of your lease or your
Yeah.
the turn through the cycle stuck with these cars. I don't think it's going to make a dramatic difference to the end of the market. I do believe it will hurt the lower end of the used EV market, and even potentially the bottom of the kind of New Zealand new used market. But
Yeah,
I think the new
I'm
vehicle
sure it
market,
will.
the fleet market, it's not going to actually damage that much.
The changes that I would like to see to overcome the perceived lack of fairness by by removing the exemption, as is at the moment, Richard, is, as I said before, it needs to have a differential 0 to 2 tons, 2 to 2.5, 2 to 3.5, and then bring ruck on for all other vehicles. So when you've got fuel excise for some, ruck for others, and then a minority paying both ruck and fuel excise, fairness at a micro level is not there, and arguably it's hard to say that fairness is equitable across it at a macro level as well. So there definitely needs to be some changes. There's a space that is just begging for some more work to be done and changes to be made, and it won't go e-ruck straight away. But I think they will, over time, make it easier for people to use an e-ruck system, and there'll be manual. And look, let's face it, there's a large section of light vehicle owners who are used to a paper-based, label-based ruck system. And Graham, yes, there is leakage, and in some areas probably reasonably too high, but it is a system that's familiar to a lot of people.
Yeah. And we're going to note something very important here, Graham. When we go ruck for all, potentially your Mustang will be paying less excise than it pays now. The winner.
Yeah, that's true.
And here's the
High
point:
fuel burning
owners
cars
of vehicles
will end up paying less.
For the owners of vehicles like that, Richard, the truth is this sounds a bit wanky to say, but I think it's probably the truth. We don't actually care. We don't purchase vehicles on that basis. If I purchased a Mustang on the basis of its fuel efficiency, then I have been sadly misinformed by my compatriots here in the show, between the three of you. We don't care. We factor those sort of things into the purchasing decision that we're going to make. The bottom end of the market.
But South Auckland family that can only get their hands on a 3.5 litre V6 Elgrand as a way to get the family around, they'll also be better off as well. So, yeah. And Amos, you'll get to start financing an extra couple of grand's worth of ruck onto every deal that you do.
There we go. Graham touched on it earlier about the things not being up to date, and we see it at everything of settlement. So when it's a private-to-private purchase, obviously everything needs to be up to date at the time of settlement. And it's funny, that's why I was nodding so much, Graham, when you're touching on that. It's like we see it so much. Road users as well, not being up to date, but also regos. It's constant.
Now, let's move on, because we are 48 minutes in and have only covered 2 stories.
Well, they're the main
Which
ones,
is how good the stories are.
Two big ones.
Exactly.
You promised Amos a story. You promised him a story.
I did. Comcom taking action against 2 car finance companies. The Commerce Commission will file civil proceedings in the High Court against Go Car Finance Limited and Second Chance Finance Limited. Now, there's a name that kind of indicates where the story's going, alleging that the lenders breached the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act when providing car finance to borrowers. Commerce Commission Credit General Manager Louise Unger says these 2 separate cases follow long-standing investigations of these lenders, looking at whether they sufficiently assessed borrowers' needs and financial means when providing car finance. In our view, both lenders have not been appropriately assessing loan affordability when making car finance available. Our legal action will address the potential for these lenders to have caused substantial financial hardship to Kiwi consumers. Unger says, as with all providers of consumer credit, car finance lenders have a responsibility under the CCCFA to ensure any credit provider meets the borrower's needs and objectives, and they must check that the borrower can, in actuality, make payments under the loan. They're seeking declaration for the High Court that both Go Car Finance and Second Chance Finance breached their lender responsibility principles. by failing to sufficiently assess whether consumers could afford their car finance between 2009 to 2022 and 21 to 2022, respectively. Apparently, Second Chance Finance has allegedly breached its record at keeping obligations, and its director failed to exercise due diligence duty to ensure Second Chance Finance comply with its dues and regulations under the Triple CFA. Right. Now, these are interesting, really. We're kind of expecting, I guess, a few of these cases eventually. We're a couple of years in now on the Triple CFA. How are people going on keeping up with the rules, Amos?
Yeah, they're very diligent. Like it's a constant thing. The one thing that is difficult is that every single finance company deems and has their own way of working out that household affordability, which obviously to fit the client under Triple CFA. And that's what's hard, and that's why you'll get a situation like this where, for whatever reason, one or two finance companies are outside of that and they weren't assessing it under the way of the Act and looking at it a different way and making those decisions, and here we are.
Yeah. Go Carrot sounds like it could be in that. Do you think, by the sounds of what they're saying there, maybe Second Chance Finance has been even a little bit looser than that, or?
Yeah, that's the way I read it too. Yeah. We've definitely had situations in the past where we've seen statement of positions on this side, and someone will have a current debt, and we are wondering how they even got there because the income hasn't changed and the expenses hasn't changed, but they got into debt, and so we obviously pass on, but you wonder how that's happened, and it's situations like this, and then it's cost of living pushes people to look into this stuff, and then it obviously just expands.
Yeah,
and,
there's always been
against poverty and so on. They'll dive into this stuff.
There's always been the argument, these people need cars no matter what. But I mean, is there a line? You may have a take on that too, Graham.
Yeah, it's actually a really difficult one, isn't it? We've talked about almost social equity in the car marketplace, and then that horrible phrase where government suddenly announced that they were thinking, or there were whispers of effectively government finance for government supplied motor vehicles, and the industry, I think, collectively had a heart attack in the back room. But it's a really difficult one. And so, for example, here, West Auckland, there are pockets of West Auckland that I have to say are pretty poverty stricken. There are some nice parts too, just saying, but there's a genuine need for transport, particularly larger families, lower income, larger families, where there's a need for transport. Public transport doesn't serve their needs. It might be there, but it doesn't serve their needs. And the question comes down to what then? What do they do? And there are plenty of predatory dealers who are either fronting the finance company or who are using those particular finance companies to become part of their business structure. We've all seen the ads. We see them on Facebook Marketplace, and we see them in other forms of media. We finance anybody, no job, no deposit, no income, fresh immigrant, no work visa. And you think I'm kidding. That sort of stuff pops up and you delve a bit deeper. And we hear the stories. We know damn well what's going on out there in certain sectors. Are those people, is it a predatory practice? Are they being taken advantage of? Or are they simply, those lenders, as awful as it sounds, are simply filling a need that people have because they simply cannot obtain funding anywhere else, and the only other alternative is to walk?
Yeah, it's a good call, man. Yeah.
Have they got, the Triple CFA stuff was reviewed once? I mean, does it need to be reviewed again, or is this just a case of that some people have pushed it a bit far? Because I kind of feel like, there does have to be a line.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing is that the absolute line is not clear. And when you have a situation where we experience it, where we have a single deal and we've sent it to first tier companies, I'm talking about, say, first tier, and they all have a different way and a different understanding and a different process of working out affordability under the Triple CFA because they're making their own decisions. Well, that's quite a hard market to work in, to understand it. So when each company makes their own decisions based on the law and the way that their lawyer or their lawyer that they've engaged reads it, that's what's hard.
Yeah.
So there's not a black and white line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Richard, you raise an interesting question about the right for people to have transport. My observation is that I've heard commentators say public transport ought to be used more. But here's the thing: if you've got a family, two parents, and just say two children, let's not forget large ones, that's 4 fares that you've got to pay for. So public transport is based on a single person, single fare. It forgets the families. Public transport is not actually good for families at all.
Yeah.
And that's the issue. And I think that's the thing that's lost here. My observation, Amos, on the changes made to the Act was that they were a step in the right direction. I'm not surprised that there are some test cases, because every time you have a grey area, and this is one of those cases where it's very hard to make absolute, a grey area, it will get tested. And I think that area of greyness will narrow over time.
Yeah.
But I am surprised to hear that there's as much variability as you're facing at the moment. That would be a bit of a worry for me.
Yeah. Still is today. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, let's move on because we've got a couple of stories to go before we kind of head out. Colonial signals weaker earnings following CCD impact. Though hopefully that won't last for too long. Colonial Motor Company has confirmed recent sales of light commercial vehicles have been negatively impacted by the Clean Car Discount. The scheme, which was officially scrapped by the Coalition Government on December 31, saw an anticipated consumer delay in purchasing of light commercials and SUVs. At a annual general meeting in November last year, the NZX listed firm forewarned shareholders the legislated end of the CCD scheme would negatively impact the non-EV market, in particular up to December 31. This has proved to be the case. The company also signalled that earnings from the June 30, 2024 financial year would be unlikely to meet the record returns achieved in the 2 previous years. I think that's the interesting line here. War says consumer delay in purchasing light commercials and SUVs, as well as the weaker demand environment, became evident through November and then materially worsened in December. For context, light commercial vehicle registrations across New Zealand were down nearly 50% for the December quarter, driven by December itself being the lowest non-COVID month for registrations in this segment since January 1999, he points out. This impacted our car dealerships in 2 ways: the deferral of vehicle sales to post 1st January 2024, and the cost of holding inventory for an extended period in a high interest rate environment. When taken against the 2022 comparative half year, the combination of these effects suggests a decrease in the half year result to 31st December 2023 to be in the vicinity of 30%. Around half of this decrease that has occurred in December. This outcome needs to be taken against the previous 2 half-year comparative periods, to December 2021 and 2022, both being at record results. On the positive side, orders that had been taken but the delivery deferred to post-December are flowing through the system now and will continue to do so during the current quarter. So interesting there that, this is just showing the real material impact that CCD change had, the market fuckery as I like to call it. Interesting to see, they will ultimately get those sales come through, or some of them come through. There are other costs, those interest costs on the floor plan, all that kind of stuff really has impacted that new car market. And I have another thought on this too, in that, we've seen COVID and then I think CCD, where there's both situations where people would have stretched out the replacement of vehicles. And then I think ultimately material has an impact, particularly from the fleet side, and that, these guys were previously on a 3, 4, 5 year cycle. This is now twice where they've potentially extended that cycle out, either because of COVID or because of this situation. And that's, trying to work out the stats in it, but 2/3 of a vehicle or 2/3 of a vehicle year that the market won't get back. That's ultimately, in the long run, cars that aren't going to be sold new because they've had those extended lease terms.
I think what Colonial didn't touch on was, I can't remember which American president said it, but it's the economy, stupid. And I think there's a much larger slice than that in the picture. Look, we all know talking about numbers in December and January is simply a case of, like you put it, market fuckery, and it'll readjust itself in time. But one of the bigger drivers right now, from my perspective anyway, is it's not around CCD changes. It's the economy. And that is going to have a longer bite with the industry, both new and used, than any obligations or model mix or changes around CCD, or for that matter now, CCS.
Yeah, I'm going to slightly disagree, Graham. I'm going to agree in part, I think is a better way of saying it. I'm usually it's economy stupid sort of person too. But for the new vehicle sector, when you do the stats and you do a long run of the stats of sales of utes, just 4x2, 4x4 utes, pre CCD and during CCD, they were only 80% of the long run average, and that's including economic cycles. So there was market stuff up by those interventions, and it was designed to do that. And so it was very successful in that regard. But yes, it stuffed it. So it's in terms of the economy goes up and down, but we also expect relative percentages of sales between different vehicle types. And so I think the CCD did make it difficult. But for Colonial, I'm surprised because I would have thought that it also presented opportunities that might offset the ute size, unless the ute sales were a large proportion of their market. But you take the CCD out, Graham, and I'm with you, and I've been on record for probably the last 4 years saying I worry about the economic direction and how long vehicle sales are going to continue at the rate that they have been, because they seemed, in my mind, to have been higher than what the economy suggests they should be. And I think we're starting to see that now, Graham. And so the economy is going to be the biggest concern going forward, but the CCD screwed things to create a bigger impact than what would have otherwise been the case.
Did you guys see lower applications than normal in December, Amos? Not in general. I mean, I'm not sure if you can split it out over commercials, but things kind of tracked on pretty well for you.
Yeah, we don't break it down by car, but no, applications were. I think for us, we're a little bit different as well, because there could have been a situation where there could have been people away and business managers away in dealerships and stuff. So we, December and these first 2 weeks of January, have had high apps. So
that, and there was, what was it, 7,500 used import Toyotas sold. Whew. Anyway, let's speed run through the rest of this stuff today, because we are cracking over the hour mark now. 4 stars for new Kona Face System Model 3 unrated. I'll summarize this really quickly. This isn't interesting itself for the story that's there. It's interesting for, I think, some of the stuff going on behind the scenes that I'm going to look at a little bit in the near future in AutoTalk magazine. And that is, there seems to be actually a bit of a groundswell against ANCAP in Australia in particular. I don't think it's really found its way here yet. A couple of things being raised around whether they're requiring a lot of driver assistance features now, but whether those driver assistance features are being tested for quality or relevance is becoming a bit of a question over there. And also whether this kind of situation where everyone's always gunned for a 5-star is ultimately realistic. And you know, and what the damage is when a car doesn't get a 5-star anymore, that may still be a safe car. If you go and look at the details on that Kona is still a very safe car. It barely misses out on a 5-star, I think, more down to some tech issues than it does to anything else. And that will be devastating for that car. And the question is whether it should be.
This has been bubbling away for about 3 or 4 years. I'll have a chat with you offline, Richard, because this is something I know quite a lot about. And New Zealand industry, generally speaking, is behind the Australian industry, that it has some material concerns about what's happening. I mean, the issue, in short, is that ANCAP and Euro NCAP, they don't need regulation to require something, so they push the market ahead of when international standards are required, and they create an artificial impression of what is safe versus what is not safe. And by saying 5 stars is where everybody should be, see as well, that's the latest, the greatest, and the most expensive of any model range, when the question is, what is safe enough? And that's what these testing regimes tend to forget. So that's all I'll say at this stage.
Now, the Tesla Model 3 being unrated, now that's an interesting thing, because that actually comes back to a situation we saw in Australia last year with the BYD Atto 3, and that it actually is unrated because there's some belief that it only has 2 tether points in the back seat of the car. Whereas if you want which is not necessarily an issue for ANCAP, but it is an issue for ADR. It means that the car technically doesn't comply with ADR. that could have some interesting impacts for New Zealand if they have that car here certified under ADR as opposed to European standard or so forth. So we're still following up on that one and what that ultimately means for both sides of the market. Now, another couple of quick ones. Avanti appoints Olsen as new chief executive. Avanti Finance Group has confirmed Fred Olsen as its new chief executive officer. Olsen joins Avanti in February from Amplify Group, where he was managing director. He has extensive experience in senior leadership roles in New Zealand and Australia, primarily at ANZ, where he led the Australian division from 2016 to 2019. Avanti founder and chairman Glenn Hawkins says Olsen's background in sales, strategy, and leading an experienced team help him stand out in the recruitment process. Have you bumped into Olsen before, Amos? Is he?
No, so no. But I looked at his LinkedIn. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Is Avanti doing some interesting things in the market at the moment?
Yeah, they are. Obviously, they've got, Motor Central seems to be at the forefront at the moment with, obviously, their side. So, yeah.
Yeah, of course, yes. They own Motor Central, don't they? Another super quick one. Smile resigns from Geneva Finance Board. Geneva Finance has advised the NZX that its independent director, David Small's resignation will be effective from March 31st, 2024. Small was the chair of the Geneva Board of Directors between September 2008 and June 2020 and returned to it temporarily as an independent director in September 2023. So that one's on. BYD Explorer #1 embarks on its maiden voyage. So BYD got apparently sick of waiting for other shipping companies to ship their cars, so they've started having ships built for them. We've discussed this before. It's not a new thing. Companies have done that previously, but these guys are doing it at quite the rate. It's also LNG powered. So it's not a oil powered ship. It's an LNG powered ship. That's the direction they're going for. I guess that is BYD's way of perhaps helping with the argument that how do you think your electric vehicle got here? Dirty bunker oil.
Oh lordy!
Hey, come on! It's the NTV brigade that pulled that stuff out.
So good.
Yeah. Well, no point docking in New Zealand for LNG right now, but hey, good luck to you in Australia.
Yeah. Iveco appoints new head of Australia and New Zealand. Iveco has appointed Glenn Dyer to lead its operations in Australia and New Zealand effective immediately. Dyer began at Iveco in early 2021 as head of sales and product. Before joining Iveco, he held executive positions in the commercial sales and financial services divisions of Mercedes-Benz, working both in Australia and the United Kingdom. So interesting one for that. They're kind of gone through a transition. They used to build a lot of trucks in Australia. Now they're a purely import one. And I think we were chatting about Iveco on the road the other day, Graham. Good looking truck there.
We
got some nice looking trucks. Yeah.
We were truck spotting, Richard.
Yes. Another appointment. Former Holden chair, now running GM Canada. Former managing director and chair of GM Holden Australia and New Zealand, Christian Nicolina. He was, of course, for a while simply the head of Holden New Zealand. Before Australia decided they really needed him because they were in trouble, and New Zealand experience is wonderful. He's continued to climb the corporate ladder at General Motors with his elevation to GM Canada President and Managing Director. He's formerly the Vice President of Vehicle Sales, Service and Marketing at GM Canada, and before that he was Managing Director of Cadillac International Operations and Cadillac Middle East. So good to see Christian climbing the ladder there. He is someone I've spent a bit of time with and traveled with. He is a very nice guy. Interestingly, that he gets to oversee the production plants they have in Canada there, and they've also got a new battery plant being built there as well.
I spent a bit of time with him, as you know, when I was with the Motor Industry Association, and he's an extremely capable fella. He's quite clear thinking and very personable, so I'm not surprised to see that he's still climbing the corporate ladder. Sometimes when they go from Australia to the Middle East, it's a sort of a Peter principle move sideways. And I was hoping like hell that wouldn't be for him. So I'm pleased.
I think they had to park him somewhere temporarily to let the Holden stuff settle. Wasn't he got essentially taken in there to do the shutdown, theoretically to save it first, but then to do the shutdown. And I think they needed to air gap him briefly, not for anything he'd done. Yeah, exactly. And then our last little quick story for the day, nice little one. Farmer Auto Village opens new Papamoa Service Centre. In addition to its existing service centres in Mount Maunganui and Whitianga, Farm Auto Village has opened a new service centre in Papamoa. Farm Auto Village says it's identified that offering clients a one-stop shop for their automotive needs is an important part of the business. Great.
You're just reading off the press release, aren't you?
Someone's popped it up there. Yeah. I think they need one out there because I've started going down that way because my father's bought a lifestyle block down in the Bay of Plenty. And it feels like Papamoa is it's like a kilometre wide, but 50 kilometres long. So you really wouldn't have to go from one end of Papamoa all the way back into Tauranga to get your car serviced. So I guess it is. I think
the whole that side of the bay is almost separated itself from Tauranga now, hasn't it? It's like it's a whole city in its own right across that side.
I grew up in Te Puke. Spent the first 12 years of my life in Papamoa. Was probably only about a kilometre long at the Mount Maunganui end at best back then. And my father had shares in a beach house. I think our nearest neighbours were about a kilometre away on either side. So it's changed phenomenally. And it's one of the fastest growing areas. So look, I'm not surprised to see it because the population is supporting it. It's a pretty messy place now, but it's just full of people, left, right and centre.
Yeah.
With money.
Excellent.
With money.
Right. Wow. That's episode 80, guys. 1 hour and 11 minutes. That's a pretty solid effort.
I'm out of coffee too, so.
Yeah. Out of coffee and out of bladder space. But
it's been a really interesting week. And I think most of the industry has now come back as well. I think I'd argue and say most dealer principals now and most of their key staff will be back at the hot seat. They should have been already. So yeah, it's a good week. Been a big week for news. There's been a lot of stuff going on. And I think now the industry is really, not use words energized, but everyone I think is very focused on what happens next. It's been a funny start to the year where we talked about. Everyone's looking really carefully at what the next steps are going to be. No matter what your role in the industry might be, you certainly have an interesting first quarter 24 ahead of you.
Yes, exactly. Right. Well, that's us for this week. We'll see everyone next week. You go for a surf, Amos. You go for a lap in your Mustang, Graham. And are you going to be with us next week?
No.
Me, yes, right. Oh, sorry, me or David?
Graham first.
So I'm here next Friday, but then I can pretty much guarantee that I won't be here the following Friday. And we'll see the next one because I'm going to be on a boat.
Yes.
And at this rate, the rate it's going, could be on a boat dodging cyclone somewhere north of Cairns at this stage. So we might be having, rather than a cruise around through to Noumea and Vila, we might be visiting Tasmania and Sydney instead.
Fun.
I've got a rather long dental appointment Friday, finally getting my rear teeth capped. But I'm going to have to say goodbye for all of February. I'm going to be on the road touring New Zealand on a motorbike with a friend from the Netherlands. A week in the North Island and 2 weeks in the South Island.
Sounds lovely. Well, if you're passing through Mangawhai, feel free to drop in. And
not quite
you might
far north.
And with the dentist, I'm sure Amos can do personal loans for dental work. But
easy monthly payments, Amos. Easy monthly payments.
Yeah.
And with that, we'll catch everyone later.